in terms of the range of instructional approaches. We do view integration as an ideal, but that's something you just can't flip on with a light switch. So I'll share a little bit of both for you today. From the explicit approach, we've designed and implemented a series of advisory lessons on emotional intelligence for ninth graders. We started with ninth graders, and the theory of action is that we'll work with ninth graders, and then next year with 10th graders, and we'll utilize some of those students that have graduated from our ninth grade program as ambassadors. Many of our lessons, our EQ lessons, are based on Mark Brackett's ruler tool from the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence. In fact, we have a partnership with, being from Connecticut, we have a partnership with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Our school has this partnership. Explicitly, we are helping students to make them aware that EQ involves recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotions. And we talk about the benefits of being able to do that, not just in school and academically, but for students in their social circles, in their families, and beyond in the workplace. Throughout this process, we're also working to build the capacity of our staff. And so as our team that's leading the Social and Emotional Learning Initiative works with students, we typically work with another teacher who's interested. And so we're building our teacher capacity or educator capacity as we work with our students. During these explicit lessons, we collect data on the impact of our work. We're using diagnostic tools from that Yale supports us with, and we do pre and post surveys, and we look at academic performance data just to measure what the impact is of these explicit lessons. In fact, we even have teachers who are writing student learning objectives that include social and emotional learning, professional learning steps that we're taking, and targeted metrics tied to EQ and academic performance. And we hope to use the data to cross-train staff as we move further along in our social and emotional learning program. Now, that's very explicit in our instruction and what we do with the results of our instruction. We're also working to integrate SEL in our across academic disciplines in our school. And we have a set of school-wide learning expectations that were developed as a part of our 2014 accreditation process. These school-wide expectations are described in a series of rubrics. The rubrics focus on community, complexity, and communication. And woven throughout the descriptors of these rubrics is a great deal of language tied to social and emotional learning. The teachers played a big role in developing these expectations, so they buy into the rubrics. And so what teachers are doing are designing lessons and assignments and assessments that reflect the language of the rubrics. The result is that the SEL language from our school-wide learning expectations becomes embedded in the work that's going on in classes. A quick example, we have a community outreach project where high school seniors go out into communities and practice their Spanish and help underprivileged people. These are kids taking Spanish as a second language, but they're working in communities where Spanish is spoken. And we're able to measure the amount of empathy that these students are exposed to and acquire throughout the process using these rubrics. What we're trying to do right now is we're in the process of planning how to demonstrate to the faculty that the degree of social and emotional learning integration that's already occurring informally. We want to validate what teachers already do as a first step. And at the same time, we want to hope to share the seed research that we're learning about to validate the benefits to integration. Ultimately, through creating an awareness and formalizing the integration of social and emotional learning, we hope to update curriculum documents so that the documents that describe what we do formally describe how SEL is embedded across learning and disciplines. We're essentially codifying what we value in these school-wide expectations and its relationship to social and emotional learning.
And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Pam to talk a little bit about what she's doing as a district leader.
Thank you so much. And I will tell you, it's just a real honor to be here today with people that care so much about the social emotional learning development of our young people in schools. I don't think that anybody misses that, whether it's the situation that we've just experienced in Florida, or the day-to-day work that our educators do to ensure that young people are coming to school and getting in place the kinds of opportunities that allow them to not just explicitly learn what allows them to be more successful in their interactions and engagement with other people, whether they're adults or young people, their peers, but most importantly, that our kids can take the competencies of social emotional learning and be able to express those in any environment that they enter, whether it's recess, whether it's the classroom, whether it's the floor of their home, whether it's out in environments where there are extracurricular activities. It shouldn't matter where our kids go, that if we're doing our job well, we will be able to see kids transferring what they're learning into practice. And we believe that that does happen with a very explicit focus on scaffolding a systemic approach to the structural elements of social emotional learning that really support that up. And I will tell you that we have been happily engaged in implementing Responsive Classroom, which is one of 23 programs that CASEL described as being evidence-based several years ago when they were looking at what programs really make a difference. And we have certainly found that in our work with Responsive Classroom, in every elementary school, every grade, expectation that every teacher implement the basics of and the advanced focus of Responsive Classroom, that what that does is it very proactively sets in place kids really being thoughtful about, how do I become a member of an inclusive community? How do I interact when I'm getting along with people? What do I do when I'm not getting along with other people? How do I communicate? How do I think about my behaviors? How do I engage in metacognition? How do I use the resources of my life in order to be a person who is a contributing member of the community, whatever that community may be? And so we really see our work in Albemarle as stacking the kinds of programmatic or approaches that allow us to build that skillfulness of social emotional learning as students move up through the system. So we've added to the mix of Responsive Classroom a focus on developmental design, which is the middle school version of that program, and looking at how do kids in middle school continue to deepen their skillfulness in their development of social emotional learning competencies. And then what's most important to us right now is that as we are making shifts in Virginia and locally around a profile of the graduate and saying there is so much more than kids just producing a transcript when they graduate, how do we make sure that our kids are successful for life, for home, for work, in school, in the moment? What is it that we would be doing to help create that transitional movement from middle school to high school? And so we're building a year-long focus with ninth graders that will be looking at, how do children learn? How do adolescents learn? How do I learn? How do I relate to other people? How do I ensure that as I am becoming a part of a high school community, that I am bringing that skillfulness that I developed as a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old now to the table as a 14 or a 16 or an 18-year-old. And so we really see that systemic commitment, that structural commitment, and thinking about it through the lens that we want our kids to be able to walk anywhere and have with them the portable skill sets of social emotional learning. We think that it will strengthen them for the life that they will have as adults, and we think it strengthens them for the life that they have right now as learners in our schools. and as members of their homes and communities. And so that's what we've really been focusing on. And we see that social emotional learning is a bridge, we believe, to academic development, to cognitive development. It's why we think metacognition, learning to be metacognitive, to think about your own thinking, your own behaviors, how you are processing what you did and where you're going is really critical. And so we're looking at that through the impact that we see on our lifelong learning competencies in terms of kids developing those up from PK through 12. But we also see that playing out in a dashboard that takes a look at what are the metrics that we believe that if we strengthen the skill sets of young people, build those, develop those, how's that going to play out in terms of climate, culture? How do we know that from the kids? How do we get that information from the kids? How do we look at other metrics that we believe start to tell us something about kids' value for learning, their value for each other, their value for community? How is it that we can capture that, not just in inauthentic or selected response kinds of assessments, but how do we get a more qualitative picture in place? So that's what we've been developing out over several years, is how do we take a look at SEL as a strengthening set of competencies for all children, and how do we systemically and structurally support that so that it's not randomly something that occurs in some schools or in some classrooms, but that it's very much just a part of who we are as a culture.
Thanks so much, Pam. That's great, and we really appreciate that overview. And I want to turn now to Jonathan, who I know has been thinking about really the systemic levers that we have around integrating social, emotional, and academic development. So, Jonathan?
Hi, thanks. And I want to build off of a couple words that both Pam and Chris offered, which is the word empathy and the word systemic, to offer another, I think, really important context for this work, which is taking a look, when we've talked about classrooms and now school districts, it's really an inside-out approach to this important work. And another way to also look at it is the importance of an outside in. And what I mean by that is looking at all the assets that a community has to embrace this work. Because I think the great real leverage is within a community. We often have principals changing schools and superintendents leaving, but communities and those that live within communities, and often partners, and I'm talking about out of school time, expanded learning, partners you come from that community and stay in that community. So they're really important to engage in this work because I think they really intuitively understand, coming out of the youth development and child development focus, they understand the importance of relationships. They work a lot on empathy, and they also understand that a systemic approach truly is one that has the ability to not only transform, but has the staying power. And they're really important perspectives. We talk a lot today about equity in this work. And I think if we really don't get to the empathy conversation and to really having compassion about the folks that are not only doing this work, but those that are being served, I don't think we really get to that equity conversation. And these are really explicit skills and areas that, for instance, our after-school partners are working on. They understand the importance of relationships. They understand the importance of building empathy. And they understand the importance of building skills. A lot of the skills that both Chris and Pam spoke to are the exact skills that I think are so critical for a whole child education, and making sure that our young people, particularly our most disadvantaged kids, again, often those that are the ones that are served by partners in our communities, are really getting those skills that they need to be active participants in our society and in our democracy, things that you heard Pam reference earlier in her remarks. So, and again, in terms of a point of leverage, why I think it's so important is again, because your most consistency and your most deliberate focus on these important areas oftentimes are coming from our partners, and figuring out how we're going to engage our parents in this work. Very important, consistent teachers and mentors for our children. It's another area that has been recently recognized as important in this work, and I think it's an area that we need to figure out how to embrace and emphasize even more so going forward. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And I think you really, drove home that final lesson that local communities are the most critical partners in shaping and driving the process of supporting students, and that we really need to think about how do we customize this to our local communities. So I know, Jonathan, you've been cataloging a lot of best practice examples across the country, and I'm going to first turn to Chris and Pam and ask them to share how community has been driving the process in their school and district. And then finally, Jonathan, have you close us out with some of those best practice examples. So Chris, can you talk a little bit about the role of community and the work that you're doing in your school?
Sure. So community is a broad term, and so I'll speak to the different aspects of it. For one of the challenges we had starting off our social and emotional learning work was funding our work, and we had to get trained. And so we were able to go to our local education foundation, and which is composed of parents and other members of our community, local businesses, and make the case for funding for social and emotional learning training and implementation in our school. And so we had that conversation from the onset with people outside of our school, and we were fortunate enough to earn funding so that we could proceed with our learning. Within our school, we have a community of teachers. Our lead team on this initiative we call the EQ8, or the Equate, and it consists of a principal, an assistant principal, and 6 teachers from different disciplines. We are a community of learners, and we work together collaboratively as equals to explore and brainstorm how we're going to implement SEL in our district. We also have a community of students in our district working towards the implementation of SEL. We have a student steering committee, which we have, they have begun to participate with the Inspire Ed initiative, and we're looking to engage students in the work of implementing our SEL program. And finally, we have a parent community. One of our lead members is doing a Changemaker Ashoka Fellowship through the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, at which he has to develop a capstone project to bring together his learning. He has chosen, this is a counselor from our school, he has chosen to engage parents as part of that capstone project. So we're really bringing a parent community into the school to learn alongside the teachers and students to move this work forward.
Thanks, Chris. Now turn to Pam. Hang on, Pam. Can you just start over? Sorry, we forgot to unmute you.
No worries. I want to think about community, and I think that Chris and Jonathan both really defined that schools are not isolated silos that exist in spaces geographically in isolation of the greater community, whether it's of parents, whether it's of nonprofits, for-profits, other educational entities, that we're really what I describe as you have to all be in together on accomplishing the work that you need to accomplish, to really look at how children who span a continuum of developmental stages of social emotional learning, cognitive development, physical development. And you can't really separate the 3 of those easily and say, now we're going to work on this, then we're going to work on that. So one of the things that I would describe is that as we've really thought about this structurally and attempted to scaffold and build foundations all the way from pre-kindergarten through our kids graduating and going into adulthood. And thinking about that end in mind, we can't really separate out either the spaces of our school community, our kids on the athletic field, on the playground, in our classrooms, in the cafeteria, in the hallways, no matter where they go in the space that we call school. What we really believe is that they are moving in and out of different communities. When they go out into the public, they're in different communities that their families are engaged with. Their families, when they come into our schools, are part of the community. But what we have really gone after is, where do we feel that we do have gaps? And how do we look outside of ourselves, that outside in, inside out model that Jonathan speaks to, and say, where are the people that know something that we don't know that helps to fill in the pieces of the puzzle or the gaps in the work that we're trying to do to build that social emotional competence? And so one of the areas that we started to really go in deeply in probably 2.5 years ago is the area of trauma sensitivity, chronic stress, and how that really disempowers kids from being a part of our school communities, despite our best efforts in the programs that we do well. So one of the things that has come out of my work with Aspen Seed has been our own version of what we're calling ACPS Seed, where we've built a boots on the ground integrated team model that's able to go into schools and help support up educators to learn deep competencies in working with kids that are in stress or not in stress, but helping to really create a sense that teachers feel more confident taking on some of the critical issues. And when the educator's job ends in terms of their being able to take it to the next level, how our SEED team becomes the scaffold to find the resources in the community and to link those resources to schools. And our SEED team has gone into our most at-risk schools. The other thing that I would just note about the idea of that, part of the work that you have to do constantly in building that sense of community is that teachers, I believe, universally value the idea that kids are able to have a sense of that their voice matters, that they have a sense of agency in their own learning, and that they can have influence. And we like to think of SEL as adding positive value to all of those things, to students' voices, to their sense of agency, and to their capability to have influence. And so we really look at how do we make sure that we're building the kind of professional learning that's not just the sort of one and done, check it off, but actually is moving through the classroom door, into the gym, into the cafeteria, anywhere that educators, whether they're defined as teacher or whether they're defined as bus driver, that they're thinking about how do I bring the skill sets that I need to bear to help kids develop up what they need. So professional development, we believe, is both explicit. And so, for example, one of our cornerstone approaches beyond responsive classroom and developmental design is culturally responsive teaching. We believe that every teacher, when they start to focus on understanding what it means to be culturally responsive with their classroom communities, they are building SEL, not just in their kids, but also in themselves. So what we try to do is we try to say, beyond the professional development that's explicit, beyond the partnerships where we have people coming into our schools or we're going out to seek those partnerships that support up kids, how is it that our instructional coaching model supports this up so that teachers are able to get very direct coaching on the work that we believe helps to strengthen their work in the classrooms? We also believe that professional learning communities should not just be about talking about kids' test scores, but should be talking about how do we build children who are resilient learners, who are people who are empathetic. What are the things that we're doing as professional learning communities to also go after that strengths-focused model that we think SEL brings? And then I would add that probably the last thing that I think is pretty important about it is that people really do have a sense of the end in mind. What does it look like for a school culture to change? And how do you know that's happening? How do you ask kids? How do you ask parents? How do you ask teachers? how do you collect that information and aggregate it in a way that lets you both look at where your strengths are and then disaggregate it to find out where there are areas that you still have some room to capture some areas of focus that you had missed before. So, you know, we think that that really is a pretty critical piece. We believe that our advisory committees, whether it's parents, our kids, we just ask our kids. I thought this was a wonderful example of how social emotional learning becomes part and parcel of everything we do. We brought in a group of kids from across the system, third graders all the way up to high school students, and we said if we were writing social media, which we're going to do, to recruit teachers that we think are the kinds of teachers that really would serve kids well in Albemarle County, what is it that you would do to communicate that out to people that might want to come work in Albemarle? And the kids they were in, you know, the typical Post-it note, coming up with their ideas of what do they communicate? How do you communicate those things? And they ended up helping us write social media to recruit teachers. But what do the kids focus on? They want teachers that are kind. They want teachers that listen. They want teachers that know how to talk with kids. They want teachers who can be loose enough that they can have fun with kids and yet at the same time really challenge kids as learners. You know, but mostly what every kid said they want in a teacher is exactly what teachers say they want in kids. That will become our social media campaign, is letting our kids be our best recruiters through a social emotional lens.
Pam, thanks so much. You've really given us so many ideas and things to think about, and really appreciate you sharing a lot of the practices that you guys are pursuing in Albemarle County. Before we move on, I do want to turn to Jonathan, who I know has been documenting a lot of best practices around community engagement across the country. So Jonathan, love to hear your thoughts on this question too.
I hope that those that are listening really take away that this isn't about either or. It's a both and. And as you've heard from both Chris and Pam, the importance of beginning to expand this work beyond classrooms and schools is absolutely critical. And why is that so? It's because we realize that a lot of our partners, they work in the same space, often in the same buildings, in the same classrooms, but they work in a different dimension. In other words, they don't have all the regulations, and they have much more, we'll call it blue sky, in which to work and operate, which is why I think many of our partners in out of school and expanded learning have been focusing on these areas, because they've been allowed to work in a space that they know is really important and good for young people. And so a lot of what they've learned and what they are naturally doing in their work is something that we can learn from, and we can begin to move into and pull into the regular part of the school day. I want to share an example by visiting in an alternative high school in Oakland in an after-school program. They were doing a creative writing class. And in this class, they were talking, and they had an opportunity, these young people, to talk about something in their childhood or in their past that was really meaningful and personal to them. And so just the fact that there were guests in this very important, embraced space shows you the kind of skill that this teacher had been able to set the context where these young people felt very comfortable sharing deep, meaningful personal stories. And this one young man told a story about how his dad, how he had tried to, for years, be able to really make a connection with his dad, and how his dad just continued to deny that he really wanted to have anything to do with his son. It was a really touching moment. In fact, there was a time when he was reading his story where he couldn't go on. He became so emotional. And the teacher didn't even have to do anything, because other students really sort of came and supported him and encouraged him and enabled him to really continue on and to share this incredibly painful but powerful moment. And it was just really clear for those that were in attendance watching this as guests that the fact that this instructor had been able to create that moment and that space where these young people felt comfortable sharing something deeply, deeply personal and often painful showed the level and the depth of the empathy, of the relationships, and frankly, providing a set of skills that these young people were beginning to master that are really critical for them to even get to the academic content. And so I think what I'm trying to say here, and what you've heard, I hope, is that, right, we can't have one without the other, that the emotional work, that the academic work, they're really entwined like a rope. And when you figure out and you're able to, through skillfully, learn how to really manage and to accelerate on your emotions, you have created an ability for young people to have not only the skills and not only the content knowledge, but the ability to use their emotions in situations that they haven't encountered yet. And that's where new learning, then that's where innovation really takes place. And in our age today, where things are moving so rapidly and so quickly, it's having these abilities to utilize skills in such a way that I think prepare our young people for really creating a world that doesn't exist, and a world where they can thrive for tomorrow.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And this has been a great conversation, and I see the very robust conversation that's also going on in the chat. I want to move to just share some of the questions that, as the commission enters its second and final year, we're really working towards our recommendations, but we recognize there's still a lot of questions that are unanswered in this space. We've been able to kind of dig into some of them here today, but look forward to continuing to dig into many of you that have joined us today, both on the chat, during this webinar, and of course, following the webinar. So I'm going to have us move to the next slide, which shares our questions. And I've noticed that in the chat in particular that there's been this running theme focused on the development of the social emotional competencies of educators. And so, Chris, wondering if you wouldn't mind taking that question first, and talk a little bit about what you're doing to support and develop social emotional competence in educators and leaders within your building. We've heard a lot from Pam as well, but love Pam and Jonathan if you two want to weigh in on that. And Jonathan, in particular, if you could talk about what you've seen being done in the youth development space for youth development professionals, that would be really helpful. So, Chris?
Sure. So it has been quite planning endeavor to map out how we're going to get all of the adults in our building on board with social and emotional learning. Maybe the youngest educators in our school have had teacher preparation classes that discuss social and emotional learning, but for many of the people, that was not part of their teacher prep. So this is new learning for them. The way we went out, and I mentioned this before, our Equate team is, I'm in a district, one school is in the district, it's a regional school, it's a high school, and there are about 85 educators. So 8 of us, including the principal, like I mentioned before, about 10% of the school has raised the money to go out and be trained on different aspects and tools of social emotional learning. We've met 15 times since the start of school, after school. Regularly we meet, we read current literature, we discuss its application in our context, we explore and plan together and implement, and then we come back and evaluate what we've implemented. Every month at our faculty meetings, since our principal's part of our team, she incorporates a social and emotional learning component, like a mini PD session. We don't want to open up the water hose on the staff and just start giving them all the information at once. So we purposely think about what is appropriate to give to staff. We are calculating that it's going to take 2 full school years to get the staff on board. We want to make sure we create that they're informed and that we have staff buy-in, not just teachers, but our support staff and other adults in the building. This collegial inquiry is validated as a part of our evaluation procedures, and it also involves actively writing grants, having members of the team go out and receive professional development. I mentioned earlier that today I'm at a conference at Yale. I'll take the information I learned today and I'll bring that back to our school. And so what we've determined outside of the learning piece, that to make this work in our school, there are 7 T's, T as in teacher, that we have to consider. We have to consider time in the school day as in terms of our implementation of our program. We have to consider talent. The implementation we've decided is going to be top down, bottom up. The administration is going to support the initiative. It's in our school goal, but it's going to be led by teacher leaders. We think we can build the support of our fellow teachers if we have teachers training teachers. We need to consider T, the treasure. That's the 3rd T, how we're going to fund the program. And a lot of that is by sharing the results of our piloting and implementation with other stakeholders to secure maybe a school budget or outside funding. We need to consider technology, which we can teach teachers and how to use technology to collect and analyze data that shows the impact of our social and emotional learning. The next T is terrain. How are we going to use school space effectively? How are we going to program the school schedule so that we can weave in social and emotional learning? And part of that schedule is our advisory program. We need to think about training, ongoing lifelong learning, professional development that speaks to the integration of social and emotional learning across academic disciplines, and the tone. The overall tone we carry about the importance of social and emotional learning. We think the EQA, the Equate, thinks that as we navigate these 7 T's, we're going to put ourselves in the path to a successful implementation of social and emotional learning that's integrated across our academic disciplines.
Thanks, Chris. That's really helpful. I love the T's, all the T's. I thought treasure was very clever. I'm going to actually, we've had a lot of other questions come in and I want to keep us moving, but Jonathan, I'd love for you to share a little bit about developing social emotional competencies, particularly in the youth development space with youth development professionals.
The real exciting, I think, good news is that because professionals in this area have a youth development frame in which they do their work, it really is built into how they do their work, what they think about, and the examples that I provided, I think, help to clarify that. What to me is powerful, and it builds on what Chris was saying, is when you start doing integrated, when you're strategic and thoughtful and you have a vision for this work that does really embrace whole community, you can start thinking about doing joint professional development sessions with both teachers during the classroom day, as well as with expanded learning and out of school time partners. When you have them working and learning together, sharing together, it really is powerful. And when you think about the great resources you have, particularly when it comes to summer work and summer programs, often you are able to utilize your teachers in this place and in this space. And I think when they often find that they are freed up from the heavy demands and oversight of the school day and the typical classroom environment and schedule, to really start to develop relationships with their young people, as Pam said, to put kids at the center and to really be asking them, what are they interested in learning? How do they want to work? Who do they want to work with? When you start to get into that frame and into that space, a lot of interesting things can start to happen, and it shifts. As Chris was talking, it shifts the way they start thinking about their work as educators and as teachers, and really as co-learners and facilitators of the learning.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I think this idea of moving towards joint professional development is really interesting and exciting, and one that I hope we can really dig into. I want to be mindful of time, and I'm hopeful, Pam, that you can answer this question pretty briefly. But we've had a couple of questions, and I think some really probing questions around making the connections for parents. How are you in your district communicating what this looks like in classrooms to parents, and how is it being received as well?
Well, I think that, you know, because of the fact that we've been deeply embedded with implementation of responsive classroom across all of our schools going back now more than 10 years, that it's become something that parents really expect to see in schools. And sometimes when we have teachers that are not as active in terms of having been through the training, perhaps as a teacher that's new to the system, our parents can be very quick to notice that. I think that also working with parents at the building level, one of the things that we really believe is that our school communities have to be able to look at educating with parents around the work that we're trying to do, whether it's more in the academic cognitive sphere or in the SEL sphere or even in the physical education sphere. So, you know, the reach out to bring parents in. One way that we've had some real success in sharing some of the strategy work that kids do is that our parents are invited to come in for school-wide morning meetings. Our kids also in a number of schools lead student-led conferences, and this will be part of the discussion with parents is where do kids land in terms of some of the things that they're working on in the areas of social emotional learning. Maybe that'll come out of their maker work, maybe it'll come out of project-based work, maybe it comes out of something that the classroom community is working on. I do want to note, though, that there are a couple things that I think have emerged in the chat room that are really worth a deeper dive, and maybe it's for a future webinar, guys. But the idea that whose social emotional learning values are the drivers of what actually occurs in schools today. And I am a real believer that educators have to be able to together study their own cultural biases, their own sense of confirming, having a sense of how the work that we do either confirms or doesn't confirm their own belief systems. Educators have to spend a lot of time together thinking through and discussing the implications of what their belief systems are and how they can go through a process of understanding that not every family comes to them with the same belief systems. Not every child comes from a family that practices the same value systems that are held perhaps by teachers or certain teachers versus other teachers. And that if you don't have a commitment to that kind of deep dive into this work, then what you basically end up with is something that feels more like a recipe in the classrooms, or may feel like that it's a check it off. But if you're really going after building a culture in which kids are developing the skill sets that allow them to work in diverse communities, work with people who are like them, different from them, and that the adults are as accountable to those SEL competencies as the kids are. This is not for kids. I see it as with kids. So that's one of the things that came out of the chat that I think is important. I would just end by saying that from a parent perspective, that every parent wants their child, I think, to have the skill sets that are going to stand them in good stead in life. We have to open the door to those conversations around what parents really see as being those learning competencies that they think are going to help their children. And it's not always, it doesn't always look like school of 1995. It doesn't look like kids necessarily sitting in rows and being compliant as being the goals of SEL. In fact, I would say it's exactly the opposite today. So engage, involved.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, thanks, Pam. And I think you brought out some really important threads that were going on in the chat and many more to discover. General McKinley is with us, and I know he would really love to close this out today. So I'm going to turn the microphone back over to him and say a big thank you to the three of you, and let General McKinley close us out.
Thank you so much to Chris, Pam, Jonathan, and the team. What a great job. I'm very impressed with the way the webinar was conducted. The commissioners and Karen Pittman and I especially appreciate the time everyone took to be part of this. We are in our final several months, and we value the inputs from all of you around the country. So thank you for letting me be part of this. And again, to those of you who had a speaking part, my congratulations. Thank you all.
And so just a final reminder that we invite all of you on the webinar today to fill out the survey embedded in our interim report. You can see the URL here. And on the next slide, just wanted to give you some dates of other upcoming commission events. As Melissa mentioned up front, we will be releasing the Council of Distinguished Educators consensus statements, which Chris, Jonathan, and Pam have all signed on to. And you can join us in person if you're here in Washington, D.C., or available via live stream. And then on Friday, April 6th, our parent panel and our youth commission will be releasing their calls to action. And we invite you to, again, tune in for those of you that can't join us here in Washington, D.C. And these calls to action will really be an opportunity for all of you, too, to express your support for this work. And just to close out, wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of some of the newer resources that the Commission has been producing. First, we've got a suite of videos that we've co-produced with Edutopia that see social, emotional, and academic practices in action. I know many of you were looking for those examples in the chat. We have a blog which will be on the EdWeek platform, which will be launched soon. So stay tuned for that announcement. As well as we encourage you to look into the Commission's first 2 case studies and stay tuned for our 3rd case study, which will focus on the school-community partnership, much of which you heard of today as the core of the lessons learned in our first year. So again, a big thanks to our panelists and to General McKinley and Karen Pittman for organizing today's session. And finally, to our audience for staying with us. We will have both a recording and this slide deck available on the Aspen Seed website. And again, thanks for joining us. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, team. That was really wonderful. I really, it was fast,
Thank you.
as always.
Yeah, it was so fast. Thank you guys so much, and for dealing with our technical challenge up front. We'll be sure to share